Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. This week's show is brought to you by Airlock Digital, which makes a fantastic allow listing platform. And David Cottingham, a co-founder and chief executive of Airlock, will be along in this week's sponsor interview to talk about why they use a kernel driver to do allow listing on Windows and how they implemented their product using the Mac OS API. Obviously, this is very relevant in light of what happened with CrowdStrike's adventures in Windows kernels. That is a terrific interview, and it's coming up after this week's news with Adam Boileau, which starts now. Adam, how's it going?
Yeah, not too bad, Pat. Not too bad at all.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to start off with this story right now, which is, well, a few stories on the same thing, which is the fallout from the CrowdStrike blue screen of death-a-palooza, which happened, 10 days ago or so now.
Such a mess.
Yeah, such a mess. So it looks like, this is turning into a mess, not surprisingly, for the insurance sector. And we've got a Cybersecurity Dive report here written up by David Jones, looking at some comments out of Moody's. And they have said, quote, "We expect reinsurers to reevaluate underwriting practices, especially for systems failure coverage, to ensure there's a clear understanding of the risk and pricing of the exposure," which I think is a very long-winded way of saying that premiums are going to go up.
That certainly is what happens in the insurance industry, yeah. And, it makes sense that they probably didn't expect that much exposure from one event, right? I mean, having so many insured companies now claiming for business interruption or whatever else they're going to go after their insurance policies for, because of one incident, that's the sort of thing that makes the insurance industry, pretty nervous.
Yeah, well, yeah. And the type of company that uses CrowdStrike is also the type of company that is going to have in this sort of insurance, right?
Expensive
so it's like
insurance, yes.
That Venn diagram is, pretty closely aligned. Now, it's not just causing drama in the insurance sector. Delta Airlines was one of the major corporations that was most severely impacted by the CrowdStrike outage. We all saw the pictures on social media of people being stranded at airports, not just social media, mainstream media as well. There were people who were stuck in airports for days. It just sounds like my personal nightmare. They've now engaged a law firm, David Boies, and they're seeking damages from CrowdStrike and Microsoft. And I'm going to be real curious to see how this goes, because as we know, software license, use agreements tend to say, my regular joke on this is they reserve the right to throw their users through a wood chipper. But you kind of think, given how anomalous CrowdStrike's approach to rolling these updates is, maybe there's a case to answer here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be legitimately interesting to see whether those license agreements terms really hold up to this, because we're talking billions. The number we saw was billions and billions of dollars worth of overall damages, of overall disruption losses. What was it, 5.5, I think someone said?
Yeah, 5.4 billion just for the Fortune 500, right? So,
yeah, right.
So I get the impression that's a conservative estimate as well.
I would not be surprised at all, right? Because it broke all sorts of things. And so, those click-through license agreements, and, there's a lot of words in those. A lot of people don't read them. And then the idea that you're going to go out to get your corporate counsel to read them and agree to them. And there's just so many kind of parts of that whole ecosystem that don't fill you with, this is a legitimate practice that is all squeaky clean and has nothing wrong with it. And a multi-billion-dollar set of losses. This is going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, well, Delta says, according to this article, at least Delta's losses alone are something like $300 to $500 million. That's $500 million for one company, which is why I say, 5.4 billion feels a tad on the conservative side.
Yeah, I remember when, early in my career, I went out to the airport to do some work on some Unix system, and I had to sign a bit of paper that says, if you stop the planes working, we're going to send you the bill, right? And I was working on air traffic control radar Unix boxes. And I went, well, my boss told me to go here and do whatever they said, so I'm doing it. But when I went back to work and said to my boss that I had signed us up for, airplane delaying liabilities, he was rubbing his temple. So, I don't know. I'm interested to see how
Well,
this turns out.
now that you work full-time for Risky Business Media, I would just ask that before you sign a similar document, you maybe check with us first, right? That's extremely not great. Now, I also did an interview on all of this with Alex Stamos and Chris Krebs. Chris Krebs, of course, being the original, founding director of CISA, and Alex being the former Facebook CISO and Yahoo CISO. Of course, they both work now for SentinelOne, which is a direct competitor to CrowdStrike. So you got to take, you got to view the interview with that in mind. They're very transparent about that. But that was a really interesting chat, from another EDR company. I thought that was interesting, and they really didn't hold back. They did not. And just said, I think when they roll updates, and I imagine for most EDR companies, it would be the same. The thing that I found most interesting about that interview is when they talked about their process for updating rules that go out to the sensors on people's boxes, right? Where it is staggered, there's a formal dynamic testing process. And the other thing that I found really interesting is that they actually collect telemetry from boxes as those updates roll out, so that they can make sure that they're not falling over. And they did admit that sometimes things go wrong. They might hit a box with an unusual config or some obscure software and there's a conflict. I did find that interesting. Now, as I say, they're a competitor of CrowdStrike, right? They're not going to be sitting there making excuses for them. But certainly the process they described seems a lot more in line with what I expected CrowdStrike would have been doing.
Yeah, and I found that as well. I mean, you would have expected an organization the size and importance of CrowdStrike to be doing it in a more robust way. But as we have seen with, a bunch of outages in, say, like Microsoft stuff, not all vendors have time. And especially, I think, the ones that have adapted to this a little bit later than, so I think like in Microsoft's case, right, with Azure, right, they pivoted pretty hard to cloud, and they're still kind of in some sense, say, catching up with what Amazon have spent a long time with AWS building. Like Amazon had a much gentler introduction to being critical infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, than Azure had. Azure went from zero to runs the entire planet in the space of what feels like months, although I guess it was longer than that. And I do wonder, because CrowdStrike's been in this game for so long, I wonder if there was a degree of complacency or a degree of,
Well, I mean, I think it was just they did it this way by validating these updates and not testing them, because that's the way they always did it.
Yeah.
And it just strikes me as classic eye off the ball, and the people who used to care about that sort of stuff don't work at the company anymore. If you want to ask me for a root cause, that's, I suspect, what is behind it. But look, CrowdStrike also not doing itself any favors in the way that it's responded to this. The most insane thing that we saw was them offering a $10 apology gift card. It was like an Uber Eats gift card for $10. You can't even get a slice of pizza on Uber Eats for $10. It just seems like the most bizarre PR response, which is like, here, peasant, have a peanut. This was only going to make it worse, because and here's the thing, right? If you want to put it into words why this was a bad idea, it's because it trivializes the grief that people have been going through. Oh, here's $10 because we just nuked your entire environment. This is just, they just keep sticking their foot in it. I don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, like, we grounded your airline. Here, have a cup of coffee. Oh no, you have to get it delivered. Yeah. Right, a delivery cup of coffee. Like, think of this is an airline, struggling with its use of carbon, and it's having to offset all of its carbon, problems. And now you're going to Uber Eats a cup of coffee, and that's supposed to, it just, I don't know what surely they have a PR firm, right? And surely the PR firm would have said, just, no, right? What are you thinking? But yeah, it just has not helped at all. And I guess this will be taught as, what not to do lessons.
Yeah, no, 100%. This is a case study in how not to respond to an incident like this. Look, we're going to change gear. That's it for our CrowdStrike discussion, although we are going to mention a little bit later on in regard to a ServiceNow piece that, anyway, that's funny. We'll get to that in a bit. But now I want to have a bit of a discussion about this piece from Brian Krebs. It's interesting on a lot of levels, right? Because it actually exposed to me something that I didn't know about how OAuth works. So the rough shape of this story is that there was a bug in Google Workspace that allowed people to register email verified accounts. So this doesn't get you a fully featured Workspace environment. but it allows you to spin up a workplace account for that single email address that you've signed up for. So there was some sort of bypass in the email verification step. So, for example, Joe at risky.biz, if we weren't a workspace shop, someone could have signed up a workspace account for Joe at risky.biz. And where this gets interesting is that this apparently allows you to OAuth into services registered under that email address, because these services don't pin an authentication method to accounts. And I did not realize that was the case. So I tested this by signing up via email for a Dropbox account, because I didn't have a Dropbox account. Signed up with my email address and then OAuth straight into it from a different browser profile from my Workspace account. So that would mean, and that's exactly what it looks like happened here. It looks like these attacks were targeting the crypto space. People were using this bug to register Workspace email validated accounts or trial accounts, and then onwards OAuth from there. So the thing that really surprised me is I would have thought that if I've set up an account to be a password-based account, like why is OAuth working? And it's because everyone places trust in Google essentially as an identity provider, which this was expected behavior as far as you were concerned, but I can't be the only one who was surprised by this.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense that you would be, if you haven't built a system like this, understanding the exact plumbing of how you integrate these kinds of auth and stuff, it isn't immediately obvious. And I think it's entirely a reasonable expectation that you had. But this is the downside, I guess, of federated authentication, of outsourcing your auth to somebody else, is in the end, you are saying whatever Google says, that's cool. Like that's what that, authenticate with Google or sign in with Apple or Facebook or whatever else button does. It just completely delegates the auth to the other platform. And if you have a flaw, like in this case, being able to bypass email verification, then that's really, that's not good. The kind of idea that pluggable authentication, where you can have lots of different authentication options, be it local password auth, be it OAuth, be it some kind of integration with a directory, like a LDAP or an Active Directory or something that isn't OAuth integration, like that as a pluggable mechanism, like to me is, sysadmin, like in Unix and Linux, for example, we have PAM, which allows you to have pluggable authentication. And so this idea of it being entirely independent of how you do auth to the application. So it makes sense to me that these are interchangeable, but I can see why that's not what everybody expects.
Yeah, 100%. And it also looks like it's possible, and we don't know, it's possible that when all of that Squarespace was going on and people were saying that these Squarespace bugs allowed people to seize control of Google Workspace accounts and whatever if they had bought them through Squarespace, and that turned out Squarespace came out and said that's not the case. I think it's kind of possible that this activity that's been written up about, because this was being exploited in the wild, right? And targeting the sort of same set of people. So I think possibly those two things got conflated, and that's why there was some confusion about whether or not there was a connection between the Squarespace bug and weird stuff happening with Google Workspace.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, because I mean the Squarespace one was also it being a little bit unclear how local auth and OAuth worked together, even though it wasn't this exact situation with, lack of email verification. But anyway, it's still a really great reminder to think whole ecosystem about your auth systems, because I had never thought of, using a Google Workspace sign up to make an account on OAuth. I never thought of that. So that's okay.
Well, extending that a little bit. Imagine if you've got control of someone's zone file and you can do a domain-based validation for someone who's not a Workspace shop. So you've got control over their zone file. You can register an entire Workspace on their domain, and then you can impersonate every user with third-party services. And we shouldn't be surprised there. Like, a zone file compromise is a big deal. Yeah. But this is one way to, turn that into essentially like an IDP compromise, if you consider Google to be an IDP for a lot of these third-party services. So even if people are using email-based auth, if you can register a Workspace account for that domain because they're not using it, off you go.
Yeah, and it's a much smoother way of doing it than the traditional approach, which is to hijack the MX, get in the middle of the email, go through email password reset, like, which is a noisy, messy,
exactly,
easily observable set of things. You're going to break their mail unless you get in the middle. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong.
It's a big difference between, inserting a text record into a zone file, right? Like, people are not going to notice that.
Yes. Yeah. And the process of setting up a workspace, like, it makes a little bit of noise, but it's not much.
No.
So
it's going to look like spam.
Yeah, exactly right. It's going to look like regular kind of fishy, spammy stuff and not look quite as sus and important as it is. And then the other aspect to this is, if I were a pen tester, or if, when I ran a team of pen testers and someone came to me and said, okay, I want to try this on this job, I would probably, as the person responsible for making sure they stay in scope, be a little bit like, I'm not 100% sure if we can do that, or like, that sounds like I'm going to have meetings about that. Do you have any other bugs?
Yeah. Do you think it's worth people who are not Workspace users to just register a single domain validated account so that people can't do this to them? Because it just, I don't know, there's something about this that just gave me the willies.
I mean, there are other options though, right? I mean, there's also with Apple, there's also with Facebook, all of the other kind of options for, like, the more
yeah, but Workspace is domain wide. Workspace is pegged to your domain. This is what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, this is why this one in particular makes me a little bit, It's not like you have to pop, if you get that text record into a zone file, you can impersonate all of a sudden every user in the, every user in the org.
I guess, like, if you're in a position where attacker's got your zone file, there's so many ways you're going to get wrecked. It's just that this one is smooth. But that's the point, right? And like, it doesn't even have to be the zone file. Like, if they can own your domain name registrar. Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, I don't know. This just feels like something that is, I don't know, like someone's going to get done this way eventually, right? Yeah. Yeah. Like, I mean, I feel like surviving your DNS zone being compromised is very hard. And something like spotting unauthorized changes to your zone, like, just pull your zone down and have a look at it every now and again, like, sort of detection would be a more generic and useful thing. But yes, like, this gives me the willies when I've got a Workspace account for my personal stuff. And like, I'm just looking at it going, I hadn't really considered that. So yeah. It's worth thinking about and discussing with your security team or people or pen testers or hacker
But see,
pals.
the problem with alerting on a zone file change is, like, how many people are messing around with that zone file? Like, is it truly weird that it changed, right? Like, someone whacked in a text record. Could that have been someone else over here if you're a big org? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it depends. I mean, I don't know. They don't change a whole bunch these days. Like, because I don't know, like, DNS is relatively slow amount of change and hopefully relatively controlled, like change management processes and all those kinds of things. Not that many people are YOLOing their zone files all the time.
I don't know, man. I don't know. Anyway, as I say, like, this was a much more interesting story than it appeared at first glance, for sure, because it certainly updated my understanding of how OAuth works. Now, let's talk about this VMware vulnerability, right?
Feature.
Yeah, so we got a write-up from Dan Gooden here, and I don't know, this is one that feels like a feature that is, working as intended. It's by design. It's been written up as a vulnerability. And what's great is we've got two contrasting stories here. We've got Dan Gooden's write-up from Ars Technica. And then this morning, just before we recorded, AJ Vicens over at Cyberscoop wrote up this one, where, the headline is Microsoft calls out apparent ESXi vulnerability that some researchers say is a nothing burger. And honestly, I kind of had that reaction to it when I first saw it, because it's like, yeah, if you can create new user groups in Active Directory, you can spin one up that is called ESX admins and then, log into these, these machines. I mean, if you got domain admin, it's kind of over at that point, isn't it? Like, walk me through why this is a vulnerability, because I'm not quite sure I understand.
So I agree. I don't think it's a vulnerability. It's a feature that is perhaps surprising, which is often the best sort of vulnerabilities in a way. Where this is impactful is when you're a ransomware crew and you want to pivot rapidly into the ESX to deploy ransomware, and you've got domain admin through the regular mechanisms that you would normally get domain admin, and encrypting the ESX is the fastest way and easiest way to go do it. Now, you're right. If you've got domain admin, you're going to win eventually. And going from domain admin to control of something like the ESX without it being, if the ESX wasn't domain joined, which is one of the prerequisites here, then you'd have to go find the ESX admins and keylog them and follow them in. And you know, it's a time-consuming process. This is just a rapid way if someone has domain joined their ESX, which I don't know that there's a bunch of great reasons to do other than, as you suggested, compliance.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we got recorded, and you're like, what's a good reason? I said compliance, and you said, no, what's a good reason? I'm like, yeah. I think our definition of what a good reason is is different. But yeah, because when it's compliance, you got to do it.
Yeah. So a good technical reason is what I meant. But yes, I agree. Compliance, unfortunately, is sometimes a good reason. So yeah, mostly it's a rapid technique. And what was interesting is that ransomware crews were using this. The surprising bit, I guess, is that if you didn't use this feature, like, so when you enroll your ESX, join them into your domain, if you hadn't set this up, that you could then just go create the group and it would magically start working.
Yeah.
And then there was also, like, because this is not a group that would exist normally. Like, if you hadn't created it in your AD, it still was known about by your ESX because it was kind of default by name, et cetera, et cetera. So it could have been communicated better, and it was in the documentation. So, like, VMware did say this is how it works, but, you know, if you didn't turn it on, you probably didn't expect it. It's a little surprising.
Yeah, I guess, but again, it just seems to me like it's designed to speed something up. Yeah. For legitimate users. It also speeds things up for attackers. Yeah. But it gets a CVE. I just find that a bit strange.
Yeah, like, I don't know that I would give this a CVE, and like, it's in the hardening.
Is it a CVE or is it an FYI? You know?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I mean, either way, I guess, like, ESX as a cloud plumbing is going the way of the dodo, thanks to Broadcom and other options for clouds. Yeah. But there is still a lot of it out there, and, you know, getting it all ransomware is pretty bad. So if you do have a bunch of ESX and it is domain joined, it's probably worth defensively creating this group and not putting anyone in it.
Funnily enough, the thing that people are ripping and replacing the, like, Citrix and VMware stuff with, like, for any VDI, it's all going island. It's all going custom browsers, like enterprise browsers, which is interesting because it's a completely different technology that you can use to achieve the same outcomes. Obviously, disclosure, they're a sponsor of the show, but I do find that interesting that that's what's turned out to be the #1 killer use case, is like ripping out VMware and replacing it with a fancy browser, you know?
Yeah, I mean, VDIs were always always a compromise in other ways, like things like sound support or video multimedia support. Was always just kind of like, videos never worked as well as people imagined they would, and I'm not surprised that we're seeing it replaced with just a browser with some instrumentation and control.
It was so exciting when it was new, you remember?
Yes. It was very exciting then, but yeah. I thought I'd be able to run Linux on the desktop forever because I could just use Windows on a VDI, but...
Yes. Now... Let's talk about secure boot drama. I've linked through to our colleagues right up on this, Catalan Kimpanu's right up on this. We've got some key exposure, which is causing big problems for a bunch of motherboard manufacturers. Like, walk me through this whole one. I didn't follow it that closely.
Right. So secure boot's the infrastructure for verifying that the boot process hasn't been tampered with on regular, x86 and now to some degree ARM computers. This involves BIOS manufacturers and motherboard manufacturers and operating system manufacturers all working together to implement a PKI, right, and have some kind of certificate-based system for asserting trust, platform trust, all the way up into the OS during the boot.
How could that go wrong? I mean, so far so good, right?
Right, and so we have a cryptographic scheme that relies on everybody involved understanding what they are doing and making good choices. And we're going to do this in a market where price really matters, where there's lots of different vendors all kind of competing. And of course, it's a mess, right? It takes a centralized org, like with vertical, the full stack control, like Apple, like Microsoft on its Surface tablets and stuff, where they can really assert strong control to do this well. A more distributed ecosystem like regular PCs, this has gone wrong. In this specific case, the way that it went wrong is that American Megatrends, who are one of the big BIOS manufacturers, so they build BIOS or EFI firmware software, and then that gets licensed by motherboard vendors to implement in their products. AMI shipped some example key material in their implementation of secure boot. And the key says, like, for test use, do not ship or do not trust or whatever it is, right there in the name of the certificate. a bunch of manufacturers and vendors of motherboards used that key material, didn't replace it with their own, shipped it, and that's not great. Like, that would not be ideal, except that then it got worse when somebody uploaded the private portion of that, the private key that corresponds to that certificate, to GitHub.
Yay.
And then, of course, because this whole ecosystem is quite distributed, there's no, like, actually doing revocation or actually changing this is very complicated, and no one bothered. So now we have hundreds, like I think 800, according to research from Binali, 800 products from the likes of Dell and other big name manufacturers, Supermicro on the server side, using certificates that are compromised in their boot process. And the net result of this is, if you land code exec on a system like this and you want to embed yourself in the BIOS for long-term persistence, as nation states are rather fond of doing, then you can sign your own key material, update the BIOS, and you're there forever. So
yeah, well,
yuck,
and
what a mess.
Increasingly, it's my impression that advanced threat actors, make of that what you will, are doing more and more to sort of like touch hardware and peripherals as well. They know how to really top to bottom own systems, like not in the way that Edward Snowden disclosed. They're doing other stuff now, right? And obviously we've got very limited visibility into that, but this is something that is a much bigger deal now than it used to be. And it's what's amazing about this is it's hard to imagine how you would chart a path towards something more sensible, because of, as you pointed out, when we first started speaking about this, the number of stakeholders involved in trying to make all of this work together. It's just too many people with too much margin pressure. And you just think, wow, is there a way that we can re-architect this to make it more sensible? You'd sort of have to start again, wouldn't you?
I mean, this is the problem with the open PC architecture, is implementing this kind of hardware anchored trust route requires that you trust everybody involved in this ecosystem. And frankly, we don't, right? We've got hardware manufacturers, all over the world, even understanding how many bits of firmware, like who do I trust? Who do I need to trust to assure the integrity of my platform? Like, who made the firmware on my network card, who made the firmware on my graphics card, who wrote the graphics drivers for my NVIDIA graphics card, like how many other components are integrated into those, like charting that, understanding all the microprocessors and all of the bits of firmware in your system. And I remember when I think Google started down the road of trying to understand the provenance of all of the drivers and firmware in their systems. And like, that's a big project, and doing it in an open ecosystem with price pressure and all those sorts of things is just really, really hard. So unfortunately, what Apple has done, which is build a vertically integrated system, and then, if you want to use the fingerprint sensor on an Apple external keyboard, it's got cryptographic key material that it shares across with the host computer to ensure the integrity of the firmware on that fingerprint reader. Like, I mean, that's kind of what it takes.
Yeah, and you
this
just
is
think,
why Apple hardware is expensive.
Well, yeah,
it's one of the reasons.
One of the reasons. It's also pretty. That's another reason. But you just sort of think, okay, is there a market opportunity here for someone to do sort of more higher assurance hardware, right, where this is less likely to be an issue? And then you start thinking about like what that would cost in terms of R&D when you're not, okay, you can buy in the processor for somewhere else, but like doing the R&D for like a whole motherboard and a BIOS and like and then spinning up manufacturing, like it's such a heavy lift. And it's such a risk. Like, you'd have to spend so much money to spin something up like this, and then you got no guarantee that the sales are going to materialize. So I think we're kind of stuck here for a while. Yeah,
I mean, this is the value proposition of someone like Dell or Hewlett Packard, right? HP, who are so big and sell to lots of big American organizations, and it's why you see them in American government environments is because they are the most trusted of these open platform vendors.
And
the thing is. And yet we are talking about, Dell firmware and HP firmware. I'm pretty sure HP was on the list of HP on the list. So like, these are the people who are doing the things that you suggested, and they still still have this problem. And what's interesting is I think Binali did this research. I think they did this research in coordination with or on behalf of Dell. So in some respects, the process is working. We are getting there, presumably because there is a propensity for the sorts of things that high-end consumers of hardware of this higher tier of vendors are worried about, firmware and hardware attackers. It's probably what's pushing it, but yeah, clearly we're not there yet.
No, we're not. Let's just, that's years of work, right? Let's see, let's see how that one goes. Now, let's talk about some Google stuff now. We've got another one from Dan Gooden. We're looking at how Chrome, now, when you try to download like an encrypted, a password protected zip or, other encrypted file format, a compressed encrypted file format, it'll now give you the option to enter the password and send that off to Google for scanning. There's a bit of hand-wringing in this article about confidential corporate information, whereas Google is saying, yeah, we rip it open, we scan it, we keep it for a short amount of time and then it's destroyed. Personally, I think this is absolutely a net positive. And we've already seen that some of the large email security firms, I think Proofpoint does this as well, where before they release a password protected file to a recipient, they'll ask you to enter the password so that they can do some scanning on it. Because otherwise it's just this completely opaque box of malware that you're delivering to a user. So, I think this is a good thing. Are you with the hand wringers on this, or what do you make of it?
I think it's a net positive. I don't think I have any argument there. I think in some corporate environments, handing over key material to a third party has probably got some hoops you'd have to jump through. But, how often when you download a zip or something, is it coming from something where you kind of trust the origin versus just something you downloaded from the internet that's got a password on it for whatever reason, where you don't really feel bad about sharing that with Google. So there's plenty of times where even if you were the hand-wringingest of persons, this would still be a net positive. And then in some environments, imagine there'll be some guidelines, but those guidelines probably exist anyway with, what material you put on Dropbox or what material you give to other cloud vendors in other contexts. And when everything's being hoovered up and processed by AI anyway, what's one zip password and zip contents, compared to the data soup that is the modern internet anyway. So yeah,
there is also a download anyway button currently for this implementation. I am a bit skeptical though that, you sort of intimated that there would be that users would make decisions around this, whereas this is a random one, this is one that got sent to me by my colleague, and that they're going to be in a good position to make sensible decisions there. I also think, quite often the way that spear phishing with these sort of things work is they appear to be coming from a trusted source. I might get one from you.
It's difficult,
for example. Yeah. So I think something like this, currently is useful for people like you and me. But less useful for the average user. But, got to start somewhere. And we've got another blog post out of Google too, which is looking at how they're doing app-bound encryption for Chrome data, like cookies and whatnot. This is actually pretty cool. What they're doing here. This is like getting Windows to do app-bound encryption stores, so that if you spin up another process on that box and try to access that material, you just can't.
Yeah, I think this is a smart move. They have a blog post up describing their implementation. But yeah, the net result is they have a driver or a process that runs in an elevated context, so a system that uses the existing Windows data protection APIs to crypto stuff. But to get the key material for that, instead of asking the operating system as the same user, and in Windows, there isn't a boundary inside a user context. Like if you're running as that user, you can ask the Windows DP API for the key material. In this case, you have to ask Google's system level process for it. And it gets it from systems DP API storage, and only will do that if Chrome is asking, if the binary asking is the path to the Chrome executable. So net result of all of this is if you're malware or, a dirty pen tester running in the context of a user, you can't just help yourself through their cookies. And of course, hopefully you can't inject a debugger into the Chrome process because OS security controls, etc. So this seems like a smart hardening and brings it in line with what you would expect on macOS and on iOS.
Yeah.
Microsoft, I imagine, will probably implement this as a feature at some point later down the track, and Chrome can move to using that implementation. But right now, seems smart. Good job.
Yeah, it's just good engineering, right? And
Yeah.
and a good use of everybody's time. And with cookie theft being such an issue, and we already walked through like what North Korean actors had to do to try to silently install a malicious extension in Chrome, and the amount of engineering work they had to do just to
Yeah, it's
do that.
fiddly.
And yeah, and this is just another great example of that. Now, we're going to look at this other story by Matt Bracken from CyberScoop, which looks at Know Before, which is, what do they do? They're like a cybersecurity awareness training company. They have admitted that they hired a fake IT worker from North Korea who made it through all of their vetting process and everything. I had a couple of people ask me, is this the company that I was speaking about when I spoke about another company experiencing this recently? No, it's not. This is an extremely widespread problem, and it's really good that Know Before have actually come out and publicly talked about this.
Yeah, because I guess other people who've had this happen have been a little bit more reluctant to talk about it, even though it sounds like in this case, Know Before, their processes almost worked. Like they were pretty close to catching this, and they did get it pretty quickly once they had hired this guy and shipped him a laptop, or at least shipped a mule that was running VPN farms for North Korea out of their bedroom in Arkansas or whatever. So it's good that they got there at the end, but it's like if you had told me 10 years ago on Risky Biz that this is what we would be talking about, like North Koreans legitimately applying for jobs and I guess doing reasonable work by all accounts.
Yeah.
Because like they must be competent enough to get the job, and if you're going to be there for like these people must be actually like, I wonder how good they are at their jobs. Like is there some process where you could hire these guys and have them doing like, is there a net benefit to having North Korean contractors in your environment? Like if the quality of the work is good enough,
it depends
and you have controls around it.
It depends how you measure that net benefit. It's probably not a net benefit given what they spend the money on.
Well, that's the other half of this story. As we've started to see some description of this money being used for funding nuclear weapons and funding other North Korean government programs and so on, which, maybe that part, like society-wide, not a net benefit, but, unsolicited outsourcing, maybe there's something to this.
Well, there's work from home and then there's work from Pyongyang, right? Which is the latest post-COVID trend. Now, look, speaking of North Korea, it's an issue that we've encountered a couple of times in the last couple of months, which is there's more and more talk about the ransomware activity that North Korea is performing. It looks like at the moment there's a couple of crews, or one in particular that we're talking about this week, that they've been hitting hospitals and stuff. So they hit their espionage targets and do some ransomware on the way out. So it's like a double attack. But they're also doing pure revenue-raising attacks against the US healthcare sector. And it looks like this activity is designed to fund to fund that group's operations, right? So they're sort of like a self-funded espionage unit working for the North Korean government, and this is just one of the ways they make money. Again, my opinion on this hasn't changed. If this starts escalating, it's going to be, it's going to be bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, we've seen so much impact in the health sector, and the idea that the North Korean government has, as you say, self-funded, like revenue-neutral intelligence gathering, where they just have to go off and pay for their own hosting, pay for their own, bills or whatever else they have to do to collect the intelligence data, and to do that by ransomware hospitals. And, I when I was reading this, I was thinking about our conversation last week, maybe there's one before that, where we were talking about like whether or not there are circumstances where it's appropriate to pay the ransom, where banning ransom payments, has some downsides as well. But then on the other hand, I read this and I went, well, like, is there ever they're sanctioned already, so I guess you can't really pay North Koreans to start with.
Well, but that assumes that they're North Koreans, right?
Well, that's
and
right?
And the people who are sanctioned start doing a better job of obfuscating who they are.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. It's just, this is such a, thorny and nuanced kind of set of problems, because we do want our health stuff to still work, and at the same time, we don't want to fund North Korean spooks. And it's a mess. And it's interesting though that we've seen the stories we've been talking about are backed by National Cybersecurity Center advisory from GCHQ talking about APT 45, which is the North Korean crew in question, and has a whole bunch of TTPs and IOCs and useful stuff like that. But just seeing the whole story laid out like that, end to end, with the funding part of it and the intelligence part of it and the ransomware victims and so on.
Yeah, it ain't great. Now, look, I hinted at this earlier, but we're going to talk about ServiceNow. ServiceNow's been doing, I guess, a little bit of marketing around the CrowdStrike outage. So they're like, their CEO is like, there are sales opportunities after this thing because we helped people recover. And okay, fair enough, right? Like, you're using ServiceNow, you're doing it right. Like, it's probably helpful in a crisis situation. But it just seems a little tacky. And I'm well aware that yesterday I published an interview I did with CrowdStrike's competitors on this. But, in my view, I don't think they were really ambulance chasing. They were just presenting a competitor's view. They weren't like, call us now and, sign up for some free licensing for 3 months or whatever. Like, that was not what they were doing. I don't know. What's funny here, though, is that, they're spruiking themselves at the same time that, earlier this month, the Asset Note guys published just some incredible research into ServiceNow that I know you're a massive fan of. So why don't you walk us through it?
Yeah, so this was some research from Asset Note that looked into a bug in a piece of ServiceNow's platform. So ServiceNow has like a cloud component and an on-premise component, and you bridge those two together with a third component called their mid server. And Asset Note had looked into this thing, which is like 20 gig of Java, which is never a good sign. And they basically found a way to go remote coding, pre-auth remote code exec against this thing, which kind of intentionally is on the internet and has access to, through ServiceNow, all sorts of privileged bits of your environment.
So what you're saying is threat actors have the opportunity to do something really funny.
Well, yeah, they do. They do indeed. So this particular Asset Note bug was just like, they've written up in a blog post. It's kind of 3 things bug chain together, and the research is great. Like, it's the sort of bug that I really loved finding when I'm looking at enterprise Java stuff, and I really feel for the amount of work that went into it. Like, the blog post is authored by someone else called Adam. So hi to you, sir. Great choice of name. And like, his mental health, I feel, probably suffered trying to find this bug. And in some respects, ServiceNow did a reasonable job. There were a number of security controls they put in place that they had to circumvent or bypass or find ways to work around. So, like, small biscuit for ServiceNow, but overall, it just was a very funny juxtaposition seeing, customers gonna get, like, if your ServiceNow gets wrecked from the internet, you are in such a bad place.
Yeah.
And so seeing them out, ambulance chasing after CrowdStrike at, within the same couple of weeks that this bug dropped, just felt a little bit funny to me, and I enjoyed it.
Indeed. Before we wrap it up, I just wanted to mention that there's a call for papers for a conference being run by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in the United States. The conference is called the Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management Conference. And just, given that this is something a little bit different, something a little bit novel, they asked me if I would mention their CFP, and that's what I'm doing now. But Adam, we're going to wrap it up there, mate. Thank you so much for joining me to talk through the week's news. And indeed, this is our first pilot edition that we're pushing out onto YouTube. Hello, everyone.
This is what we look like. Sarah, terribly sorry if it's disappointing.
That's right. We got great faces for radio. Exciting stuff. So thanks a lot, and we'll do it all again next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. I will talk to you then.
All right, well, it is time for this week's sponsor interview now. The other day, I did an interview with David Cottingham, who's the chief executive of Airlock Digital. Regular listeners would know that I'm a huge fan of Airlock. They make an allow listing solution, which is also really useful for hardening Windows boxes. You can crush lol bins. They're just launching browser extension allow listing as well. Like, it's just it's a terrific product. And I've been talking to Dave a lot over the last couple of weeks because there's been all of this discussion about security companies using kernel drivers, and it's turned into such a big topic. And Airlock does use a kernel driver to get their things done. It's only like 60 kilobytes. It's a very simple static driver. But I thought it would be a good opportunity, seeing as they were scheduled as the sponsor this week, to talk to them about like why they're in the kernel and what it looked like when they were forced to do an API-based implementation for Mac OS, and also talk about their Linux implementation, which is not kernel driver based. So yeah, a fantastic discussion with Dave Cottingham from Airlock Digital, and I'll drop you in here where Dave explains really why Airlock's in the kernel to begin with. Enjoy.
So there is so much to unpack, I guess, in that question. I think the main thing about developing for APIs is you really lose the ability to be specific, all right? And that has an impact on the level of security you provide. And also, you lose the ability to be as performant because the API has a lack of specificity. That's always a difficult word to say.
Specificity.
Oh, nice. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. So because you don't have that granularity, I'm going to say, you end up getting flooded with events because the temptation is to go, well, I need to see everything, so I'm going to subscribe to all of the API endpoints, and then you ended up processing way too much, which is just not possible. So, especially on, I guess, our experience on Linux and Mac is the biggest challenge is getting what you need, filtering appropriately, and only processing the bare minimum, because, it's a visibility plus performance constraint that you have with the APIs. Yeah.
Now, I know that, you and your co-founder, Daniel Schell, have spent time looking at re-implementing your software and before all of this CrowdStrike stuff, right? Because it's an existential fear for anyone who's operating security software that lives in the kernel that one day Microsoft's just going to say, we're kicking you all out, here's an API, or just use our existing APIs. And indeed, Microsoft has published APIs, has engineered APIs which would allow security companies to re-implement most of what they need. But I guess I'm curious what the shortcomings are. I mean, what you've told me so far is it would be hard, but you haven't said that it would be impossible, right? So help me understand what's difficult and what's impossible when you're dealing with Microsoft's current APIs here.
Mm-hmm. So I guess it's Microsoft doesn't really have an API for endpoint security vendors in the kernel today. There are little APIs around, like let's say a user mode example is AMSI, or the anti-malware scan interface for PowerShell. And let's say we want to inspect bad things that PowerShell's doing. You subscribe to that API, and then what happens is PowerShell has a defined list of sort of criteria internally to its application about what is malicious, or that scan interface. And then it sends you back part of whatever its latest buffer is that it processed. And it does some really cool things, like it deobfuscates if there's base64 code, it decodes it, and it says, this is a buffer that I think is malicious. And what you're left with as a security vendor is saying, okay, well, do I think that buffer is bad or not? And you have a choice to allow it or deny it. And then you send it back to PowerShell, and then the AMSI interface will either allow or prevent that code from executing. So that's sort of the level of control you have. And you're like, yeah, great, I'm adding a lot of value here because, even though it's great, but you're really not adding a lot of value as a security vendor on top of what anyone else can do. So it's really about the limitations. It's about capability. It's about
performance, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. It's about so many EDR vendors. It's all about detecting the latest stuff. It's about being the technically the best that you can be, and APIs really stop you from doing that because you get to a bar very, very quickly, and then it stops.
But would it be possible, I guess, is the question, for Microsoft to implement something decent, right? And you've told me that the Mac OS one, because your software obviously uses the Apple Endpoint Security API, and based on what you've told me, is it's great, it's fine, it does what it needs to do, although there are some things you can't do. So let me ask you a question in two parts, which is like, what could Microsoft do and offer which would be acceptable? And, based on your experience with macOS, what would you expect the limitations to be?
Yeah, so I think based on our experience with macOS, we've definitely hit for our product type, which is generally a file access control solution. If you think about it, we're about allowing or denying access to particular files. We've really hit a limit there, and we've had to make some concessions. So, for example, like the AMSI example, Apple. You sort of say to the ES framework, which is the API framework in the kernel in macOS, tell me about all files that are executed. And it goes, okay, I'm going to tell you about every file execution. And that's great. Really, you can process that. Now, that's a lot of messages already to process. And that resulted initially in really high CPU for us. So we had to do something called muting, which is, okay, well, we have to get rid of this flood of API messages because macOS and Linux are sort of file-based operating systems. So we've got to calm the API down a little bit. So there's flags in macOS that say, don't tell me about any execution of Apple native system binaries. Great, you just drop out 80% of the chunk there, and then you only look at the exception.
A big part of the hardening work you do is about like neutering all the lol bins, right? So I guess that's
exactly right. So that's the first concession, and then you look at that definition of tell me when a file is executed. So Apple, Linux, Windows will have sort of a definition, I guess, of what is an execution, and that's really any file that executes natively on the operating system without a third-party interpreter. But let's say a script execution. Well, the framework doesn't consider that an execution. So what's your next best option if I want to catch script file types? Well, I need to subscribe to another endpoint, which is tell me about every single file that's opened on the system. And now, as you can imagine, that is orders of magnitude, even more of a flood. And then you end up filtering on that. And then you end up saying, okay, well, I want you to tell me about all file opens except for these type of things, and you have limited options to do that, which is like, okay, I want to mute based on file paths or X, Y, and Z, and then you're like, okay, I've seen that a script file has been opened. What do I do now? I see the command line of that, and then you sort of start to chain APIs together in order to achieve what you want. This is why vendors are in the kernel, because you can filter,
you can do what you want,
things together,
right?
yeah. And you can say, tell me when I need to process something.
Look at me, I am the OS now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, like, I did a talk at OzCert this year in Brisbane, and I talked a little bit about the security
Gold
layers.
Coast, but anyway.
Gold Coast. Oh, sorry.
Same thing, Queensland.
They're pretty close. And essentially I showed an absurd attack chain recently where an attacker did one thing into the next thing. You drop a script to run another thing. And that's a really good news story. It's the fact that our detection software and EDR has gotten so good nowadays that we've pushed attackers to such an absurd level of complexity that we're talking about these edge case techniques. That's awesome.
Well, and often they rely on misconfiguration and no one watching, right?
Yeah,
I mean, people love to crap on EDR, but when it's configured correctly and it's being observed, it's very good.
Exactly right. But you now need to engineer for those type of really low level detections, via an abstracted API, which inherently has limitations. One example, and we're not just talking about endpoint security here. This is backup software, encryption software, DLP virtualization. And you look at the state of virtualization on macOS today, and API is limited, right? So there's a software called Parallels for Mac, which allows you to virtualize things. And they actually say that the virtualization framework's in its early stages, and as a result, it does not enable many features that exist in the older Mac processors. You can't do snapshots yet. You can only recently resize disks in guest VMs.
Yeah.
And so there's this slow march to capability, but Parallels as a company is essentially constrained by that. I think in order to develop an API, back to the question for endpoint security, you would have to expose, to do what EDR does today.
I mean, you kind of need to, excuse me, this is where I keep landing as well, is you kind of need to expose APIs that have the power of a kernel driver, and there's going to be some risks involved there, you would think, right?
Exactly. You're writing a kernel driver for an API, which
it's
is
just
so
everybody's
complex.
Kernel driver at this point, and it's got to be mega flexible.
Yes. And then what you have the problem is, like, the reason why you want to be in the kernel is so you can detect everything above it. Attackers don't land in the kernel when they get in a box, right? Like, you've got that sort of, you're on top of the castle. You've got attackers running across a bridge. You've got a chance to see everything really well and get them before they get to you. It's sort of like that fortress mentality. And you just you've got to have that level of separation, I think. And if you're in user mode looking down through an API, it is far easier for attackers to say, okay, well, I'm seeing your user mode security program that's subscribed to this API. How about I tamper with the API? How about I mess with you in user mode? And you've just got a different challenge there when you're trying to defend against that.
You do, but you know what you don't have? BSOD.
Yes, and I guess that look, and I've got to recognize my bias here as a vendor that uses kernel drivers, of course. But yeah, it's true, and I think that's a legitimate discussion to be had. And yes, look, you have the advantage of your API application crashes. Like ES framework is brutal to security vendors. It's like if you stop working, or you're not performant enough, or you don't respond in time to the ES framework. This is the
macOS API,
yeah, the
right?
macOS, yeah. They just kick you. They just destroy you. They go, you're deregistered now, go away. Because their user experience is the number one thing. And they also, and this is our experience, I haven't seen any documentation that suggests this, but because you're in user mode, it also, one, you can see all the CPU usage that you're using, but they attribute your usage of the APIs as you are doing bad. So Mac will pop up and
if you make the APIs go brr, they kill you.
Yeah, they go, this security vendor using a lot of CPU over here. This is the problem. Whereas if you're in the kernel, as a user, you look at Task Manager, you go, it's all good. Like, we've had so many people that have reached out to us over the years and gone, hey, AppLocker uses no CPU. WDAC uses none. It's zero. And I'm like, no, there is a cost, but you just can't measure it or observe it because it's actually, you're done at the filter level. But kernel code is, really performant. So yes, it is less, but it's also invisible, I guess. This is why people don't really think about drivers.
This is why CrowdStrike appears to be extremely efficient, is because it's chugging away in the kernel, right? So that's, that's another thing to keep in mind.
And I would attribute that design to be, this is the reason why they are the leader in the space.
Yeah, it's a big reason for sure. So another thing I wanted to ask you about, though, is, we've been talking a lot about what it would look like if Microsoft were to implement a full sort of EDR capability, API. But, being an allow listing company, you don't really need all of that. And I imagine it would be quite straightforward for Microsoft to engineer an API that you could use to re-implement your product that's not like a full EDR thing. And I think your co-founder is, your CTO, Daniel, he's already played around with trying to use native functionality like App Locker and stuff to try to re-implement your product. And it's a bit rough around the edges, though, but it would be very easy for Microsoft to give you the sort of API you would need, wouldn't it? Much easier than trying to do an API for all of EDR.
Yeah, that's correct. I guess we don't need to sit around and wait for the Microsoft name pipes API, right?
Yeah.
It's that, and you could argue that something like that would never happen, but we're playing a different game. We're a different product, and as I said, we're really about file access. So largely where we are in kernel space is really just, hey, tell us when a file loads, with specific flags, and then we'll do an allow or block operation, and we sort of have that luxury. And we actually on Linux, for example, we started out in the early days with kernel drivers, and because we're a smaller team, the prospect of continuing with kernel drivers and recompiling for all the different Linux kernels that were out there all the time, because basically on Linux you have to sort of build your driver against a specific kernel version for it to be safe. And it's just that in itself is a huge amount of work. So we sort of went, can we make this work with the API in Linux, which is called FA Notify, or File Access Notified, and we can. You know, and depending on the kernel version you're on, there's different performance between it. So as they've added additional functionality to FA Notify, we check to see what functionality is available on the kernel when we register, and then we operate in different modes. You know, and you know, we've on older Linux kernels, there's a far higher CPU overhead on busy systems than there is on newer ones, just because of that capability constraint. So look, yes, is the answer. We could, but again, we're sort of we're playing a simplistic game compared to a lot of these other vendors.
Yeah. So it sounds like, you know, from your point of view, kernel driver is amazing. If you had your way, you'd keep it. Second best choice would be something like the Linux implementation, and oh God, don't make us deal with something like the Apple API again. Seems to be what you're saying.
Yeah, look, the Apple API is more full-featured, but I think it's just it's the Apple mentality of of do you really need this anyway? That you know, they sort of Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, Dave Cottingham, thank you so much for joining me for that conversation. That was all really interesting stuff. I'll be curious to see what they announce for Windows 12, right? Because I imagine they're going to announce some sort of API that won't be quite enough of what you need, and you're going to have to ring Microsoft and beg them, and can you please implement this or implement that, or you'll have to cobble something together with probably with AppLocker, I'm guessing, is going to be a big part of the solution there, right? But
I think we're in very interesting security times from an ecosystem point of view, and
but I guess the point is, though, it'll be okay, right?
The industry finds a way, right?
Yes, so. That's right. All right, mate. Great to chat to you. Look forward to doing it again. Cheers, Dave.
No worries. Thanks, Patrick.
That was Dave Cottingham there from Airlock Digital. Big thanks to him for that. And that is it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. Until next week, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.